Conversation live from Tirana. My name is Grace Osmani and I'm delighted to moderate this talk. This conversation is celebrates the 25th anniversary of the International Conference on Population and Development, the ICPD. The focus of today's conversation is sexuality education. This topic is particularly close to my heart because from 5 years now, I'm serving as a YPer in my country, Albania, reaching out to young people in and out of school with information on sexual and reproductive health. Another reason why this area is very close to my heart concerns the fact that my mother, who at the same time is a teacher in one of high schools of Tirana, is a strong activist and advocate on sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people. She's even providing coordination for the youth club established in this school. She's amazing and she's a great motivation and inspiration to me in my work and mission as a YPer. I want to highlight here that the support that families provide to young people is so important to have a confident, well-informed, and empowered young generation. Today we have 4 outstanding leaders on our panel to discuss what's changed in the terms of sexuality education in this region. Mr. Ketene is the Director of Agency for Quality Assurance and Pre-University Education. We have Dr. Evert Ketene, who is the international expert on sexual and reproductive health and rights on comprehensive sexuality education. Mrs. Magda Kostava, board member, Association of HERA 21, and member of IPPF. Also, Mr. Ian McFarlane, UNFPA, Deputy Regional Director for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I will give the first floor to Mr. Ketene, who is providing leadership in the country and is playing a great role in implementing and scaling up comprehensive sexuality education at pre-university level. So, Mr. Ketene, Albania has gained a reputation as a pioneer of sexual education in southeastern Europe. If you look back at the last 2 decades, what would you say is the reason that Albania has been progressing further than many other countries, and is there anything that others can learn from the Albanian experience?
Thank you, Graca. It's a good opportunity to share our experience. When we start reinforcing the program we signed for the first time with Jan a few years before, we were thinking how to developing a new program that came back from 1995. And immediately on discussing with teachers, kids, and parents, we were thinking, what should a program be in Albania implemented and be successful? And there are 8 or 9 or 10 strong topics for us that makes the program successful. First of all, we were thinking that a program should be composed in 3 levels, implemented in different aspects of the subject of the curriculum, implementing a new system of teacher training, and the 3rd pillar was advocacy. The second way of thinking at that time was that the program should not be copy and paste by other countries, but should be a local experience that comes from Albania. Albania is a dynamic country with different realities, different societies, subcultural, not multicultural, but subcultural. What happens in Tirana may be totally different even in suburban areas. What happens in another city may be different from rural areas. And this kind of reality gives different shapes to the program. Another, let's say, strong point of the program and the success of the program was the supporting and matching all the actors together. UNFPA has been a leader in promoting the program, financing it, but at the time the Ministry and the Ministry of Education, even 5 or 4 years before, even now, as Ms. Shaini said, has been a key leader, and all actors inside the Ministry of Education and Sports and all the chain of the Ministry of Education, Sports and Youth, national directories of the small cities, has appointed key persons that follow the implementation of the program. The 4th element that is very, let's say, important to work is working with the same intensity in 3 levels of education, working with elementary schools, working with lower secondary schools, and working on secondary schools. So it means that we cover the ages from 10 to 18 years old. The program has another strong point that it creates a pool of experts that comes from internal problems of education, and these are the teachers that sometimes has to break taboos on teaching issues on health and sexual education, and you have to create some space to them, space of thinking, to motivate them on teacher training process, to accredit the system of training, and to give some, let's say, freedom in the way how they compose the process of teaching. Today that we are speaking, we have different examples of different hours, how you can implement the program from their realities. Maybe there are different similarities in different cities, but even in one city you can find different way of how a biology teacher can explain different issues from another school. So even though Albania has a centralized system, I mean, we have a curriculum that schools should be followed, and they have 10% or 20% freedom. On this program, we have given more freedom to them, to be more creative and to discuss much more freely with the kids. Sometimes when we go to the schools, we see that the kids and the students are much more open than the teachers, and it's a natural process. It's a differentiations of way of thinking and mentalities between ages. And teachers has to squeeze their emotions and to open themselves on beyond with on parallel ideas of how kids starts thinking. It has been part of ministerial orders. In Albania every year the ministers give a kind of, we call a guideline for academic year, and every part of the program is very specific in the way how it is implemented, which gives power to the program and takes a kind of, let's say, implementation year by year, and it turns back the program to a strong tradition. The eighth element that is very, very, very nice to explain is a kind of, let's say, a relationship that happens between higher education and pre-university education. In Albania, according to our studies, universities that form teachers furnish the pre-university education sectors with new teachers which spend at least 5 years to understand what happens on pre-university. And 2 years before, we started reforming their curriculum, the curriculum of the universities that forms teacher, with different teams that comes, experts that comes through university, and experts that are on pre-university education system in revising the curriculum. And it has started the discussion that even on the curriculum of higher education, health and sexual issues, reproduction issues, should be part of the curriculum. On that part, when a teacher gets a diploma and enters into the system, has the same capacities and possibilities to re-enter in this kind of program immediately. So it's a kind of matching the two systems, higher education and pre-university education. And of course that investing in 4 or 5 years in this kind of program with this kind of intensity, it breaks the taboos, it gives freedom to speak, not only to the students and teachers, but it involves even the parents. We have, and this is my first explanation about the quality of the program. We have a strong discussion, let's say, 5 or 6 months before. It was a case in Kavaja, a supposement that something happens inside the school with a girl who denounced a sexual harassment into the school. We've been, let's say, in a strong debate into the media, which are the responsibilities of the Ministry of Education, what are doing the psychologists, what are doing the teachers and stuff like this. And of course, immediately we take some options. What can we offer to the system to raise awareness? And today that we are speaking, we have, let's say that it seems it's very easy. We have 3 manuals of sexual abuse. One is directly for the students and is adopted to the ages of the kids, which explains, let's say, what is sexual abuse, why it happens, or what can you do if it happens, etc. We have another manual for the teachers. What can they do if they notice? How is linked with other social problems and economic problems into the area? And of course, we have another options of sexual abuse manual for the parents. So, in small problems that can happen in one school, you can create ideas and regenerate ideas how to furnish the program with publishing, manuals, discussions, and others. Anyway, for any other issues and comments and what happens even with the teacher in the schools, we will have the chance after to give other examples.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights, also explaining in detail the work that we have been doing here in Albania. I'm heading now to Dr. Evert Ketene, who is the international expert in the field of comprehensive sexuality education and more broadly in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights. He has extensive experience in the sexual health and reproductive system, also HIVs and AIDS fields, in particular Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Turkey. Dr. Ketene, can I ask you to give us an overview of how far we've come in Europe over the past 25 years with regard to introducing comprehensive sexuality education? And how are the countries in the Eastern and Southeastern Europe doing in comparison with the rest of the Europe?
Thank you very much for your introduction. You do it very well. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and it's particularly a pleasure for me to be here in Albania, because I've worked in almost all Eastern European and Central European and Central Asian countries except Albania. So it's really interesting for me to be here in Tirana the first time of my life. The question I'm asked is a very simple one, and it's a very complicated one at the same time. It's very simple because if you ask me the question, what changed during the past 25 years, in Europe in particular, and in Central Eastern Europe even more in particular, the answer is very easy. Everything has changed. Really, everything has changed, and particularly also with respect to sexuality education. A lot has changed. At the same time, the pace of change has been very different in Western Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe, which is very understandable, because in Western European countries, I myself, I'm from the Netherlands, in Western European countries, the process of change when it comes to adolescent sexual behavior and sexuality education, it started in the 1950s, 1960s. And that was long before it could start in Eastern Europe, because the conditions were very different here. It could only start here after 1990, basically. So we had a leap of 30 years in Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe. We could simply start earlier. Then the question, what changed? It's a really complicated one, because almost everything changed. First of all, most importantly, let's look at the young people themselves. They have changed tremendously in 2 generations' time. You know, if I look at my parents, you know, in the period in the 1940s and 1950s, what happened was that young people at some point in their lives, they would have sexual relations. The result would be, because there was no contraception, nothing, there was no education on prevention of unwanted pregnancy, the result was an enormous percentage of young people having their first intercourse and immediately marrying, so-called forced marriages. You know, there was no alternative. So they had a forced marriage, and the result of that has been that many of those marriages ended in divorces, because, you know, they were not made for each other. Nowadays, if you look at young people nowadays, they can experience, they can try, they can look, they can resolve, they can make up their minds, etc., before they enter in a permanent relationship. It's very different. 2 generations ago, it happened immediately. Now, people have a long period in which they can decide what they want to do with their lives, how they want to organize their lives. And they have a much longer education than people 2 generations ago had. They have much more opportunities for education, which gives them a better start in life. So, young people in general, they're better off than their parents and their grandparents were in the past. Now, I have worked here in this part of the world since the early 1990s, and I'm always happy to be back here in every country, because what we did in the Netherlands, we organized a course on sexual and reproductive health for Central and Eastern Europe after 1990. And during that period, in the 1990s, we trained about 250 people from Central and Eastern European countries, and I think from Albania we already had 12 or 13, who knows. So I see several people that I know because they came to my course in the Netherlands for 3 weeks, and we were very happy to teach them what was going on, particularly in Western European countries, so that it could also, that development could take place in Eastern European countries. I see a trainee of mine here, I see one there. there are several of them. What has been particularly important in speeding up the process of acceptance of adolescent sexual education has been the role of the United Nations organizations. Really, we should be proud of having the United Nations and seeing them in the driver's seat when it comes to development in this particular area. At the same time, it should not be exaggerated. It should not be exaggerated. The development of sexuality education took place before UN organizations started to become involved. Really, really. The first law on sexuality education is from Sweden. At that time, Sweden was always the first. Sweden, 1955, it made sexuality education mandatory. What we forget easily is that it took 15 to 20 years before it came really off the ground in Sweden, because everything had to be developed from scratch. There was no experience, there were no good examples, so the Swedes, they experimented with it and they built it up, etc. And they trained the teachers, but they didn't know how to do it, etc. You could easily say there was no sexuality education in Sweden before 1970, in spite of this law in 1955. But then it went very, very quickly, because after Sweden made this decision, then other Western European countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, they came with laws on sexual education inside school, outside school, etc., etc. The interesting thing is that development took place in European countries in spite of the fact that we had the European Union individually in the different countries. Individually in the different countries. They didn't listen to each other. They didn't learn from each other. And it was thanks to the World Health Organization collaborating partner in Germany, and she's sitting there, Laura Brock-Schmidt. Please, Laura. They started in 2008, the collaborating center in Cologne in Germany. They started to put together the European Expert Group on Sexuality Education, which were representatives that were really working in this field from 13, 15 to 14 countries in Europe, to put their heads together and to learn from each other's experience and to come up with recommendations, with publications, etc., etc. And that decision by the BZGA, you see it, it's hidden here, here's the BZGA. It has been very important because it played a role first in Germany itself, but then immediately after that in all European countries. So the most important document that has been prepared by BZGA, the WHO Collaborating Center in Germany, has been the standards for sexuality education in Europe, which is now available in 13 European languages. Can you imagine? 13 languages we have the standards for sexuality education. And other publications are now also coming, being translated, and the latest is the study that we did 2-3 years ago on the status and the recent developments on sexuality education in all European countries. And that has been a very important document, really. It is not because I'm the first author of it, but it is unique because there was nothing like that. There was no overview of what happens in reality in the different European countries when it comes to sexuality education. So in that sense, this document is really groundbreaking, and we have learned a lot from doing this research and from the outcomes that it has provided. What we see, for example, and just give a few examples, I'm not going to take all your time, is that there are some thoughts many people have that turn out to be completely incorrect. When it comes to sexuality education, you know, there are two fears that people, and particularly parents, I'm a parent myself, that they have when it comes to sexuality education. The first fear is, if you teach them about sexuality, they're going to do it. I see people nodding. Everybody immediately understands what I'm talking about. You know, parents are afraid that their children are going to have sexual intercourse at earlier and earlier and earlier ages. That is the idea. That is the idea. If you teach them, they're going to do it. They're going to do it. And then hell breaks out. You know, that's the worst thing that can happen. Our study shows that in the countries in Europe that have comprehensive, really comprehensive sexuality education, the age at first intercourse is exactly the same as in countries even that do not have anything in terms of sexuality education. Now, it's exactly the same. It is exactly the same age. That is one thing that is really important to keep in mind. It does not lower the age at initiation of sexual intercourse. It's totally independent of sexuality education. The other thing it shows, that in countries where you have comprehensive sexuality education, where that is the case, and where there is experience in this particular field, you see that contraceptive use is much more effective than in countries that do not have comprehensive sexuality education. As a result of that, you see that the teenage pregnancy rate in countries without comprehensive sexuality education is much higher than it is in countries with sexuality education. The same is true for the teenage birth rate. The teenage birth rate in countries without sexuality education is 3 times higher than in countries with comprehensive sexuality education. I'm not going to say that this is a causal relationship. It's much more complicated. There are factors that make sexuality education acceptable, and at the same time those factors, they also influence contraceptive use, etc., etc., etc. But it is a fact of life. Now, what is the situation, finally, the situation in Eastern Europe? I have been lucky to be at the start of the development in all the Central and Eastern European countries, and the development that we in Western Europe went through in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s took place here, starting in the 1990s. So you start later. It cannot be expected that you are at the same level as the countries in Western Europe. It's unrealistic. What we have learned in sexuality education is that it is a cumbersome activity. It takes 15, 20 years before having it really organized, sexuality education, because you have to train the teachers, you have to develop the materials, etc., etc. You have to do all these things, and it takes time. So it is unrealistic to think that you could change the world overnight in this respect as well. But what I'm seeing in Central and Eastern European countries is really promising. It's really promising because it develops quicker in these countries here than it developed in the 1970s in Western European countries. It goes faster here because you have the good examples. You can learn from the examples. So we are here, and I'm happy to say, you know, we want to support you in every possible way. We want to support you in every possible way. And you find the publications outside, but there are people around here that can really help you to make a quicker start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ketene, for sharing your valuable lifetime experience. And I'm confident to say that there are a lot of participants in this workshop who are looking forward to your representation this afternoon. So please be prepared for many questions. It's my pleasure now to introduce to our next speaker, Magda Kostava. Magda works in the field for more than 8 years, and she's a member of Y-Safe Advocacy Advisory Group. She's a youth activist, a peer educator, and conducted dozens of informational and educational sessions throughout Georgia. Mrs. Kostava, you are, like myself, a representative for the young generation. You've experienced firsthand how difficult it's still for young people to realize their very basic right to information. From your experience, why do you think we're struggling so much in our region to make sure that young people have the information we need?
Good morning. Sure that, okay. So, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm honored to share with you our experience and practice. At the same time, I feel the huge responsibility that I am representing here thousands of my peers' voice, and I will do my best, and I really want to discuss during these days all barriers and challenges which stand in front of us in the way of realization our basic rights to education. I have worked more than 7 years in the different SRHR programs and projects, and I did different type of activities, advocacy activities to ensure availability of youth-friendly services and comprehensive sexual education for all. I'm a peer educator, and I have conducted dozens of informational educational sessions for my peers in the hard-to-reach areas, in the hard-to-reach and in the mountainous areas. So I have deep understanding the needs what we have. I have read a lot of reports, guides, and different type of the documents which says that comprehensive sexual education is very important, and yes, young people really need it, but I believe that it doesn't show the scope of the, it doesn't show the real needs and the real emotions of what young people, the real scope of the young people's need. So I have met, during my experience, I have met 13, 14-year-old girls who are forced to marry and who have kids, and they don't have information about the rights, about their body, about their family planning, contraception, and they just don't think that something happens beyond their family. So I really believe that they are the victims of the system, and because the system doesn't give them opportunity to realize their rights and to realize their potential. I have met girls and boys who were ashamed because they asked about their body and about their information, and they just wanted to get information about the problems which they face their everyday life and during the puberty, and they were ashamed. And the only answer they can get when they ask the question is that you know better than me, and they can get these answers from their parents, from the teachers, and they don't have any option. So they are trying to find other sources of the information that, and we are not sure that they are credible and they can get the right information what they need. So So what are the barriers? We are still facing a lot of myths and misconceptions about the CSE, and one of them was mentioned here, that if we give comprehensive sexual education to youth, we will encourage them to start early sexual intercourse, and we will and the belief that sex education will lead more sex. That there is no evidence, despite the fact that there is no evidence that proves this, they still believe, and they still use this as a main argument when we are talking that we need it. There are myths that CSE is against our traditions, about our culture, and about and is against our religions. That that we are losing the past and we are losing the future if we will give them comprehensive sexual education. And there are these biased fears that have no basic evidence, just only doing one thing. They are delaying the progress, and we are losing the generation, and we are losing time on the charge of the young people's health. They believe that it doesn't happen to my child. This is one of the most common beliefs that the parents have or teachers have. It doesn't happen to my child. It doesn't happen in my class. And the fear to take the new reality and the answer to challenges are not and don't stay in the past. This is the main challenge, that we don't take new reality that maybe 20 or just 40 or 50 years ago, it was a different reality and different generation. So now is the different reality, so we should act and answer all the challenges what our youth have. So what we do and what is the scope of our work? As you mentioned, I'm representing the Georgian Non-Governmental Association, HERA21, member association of the IPPF European Network. And what we do and what is our experience, so we are trying to create the evidence to oppose those myths. So our main work is to create the positive environment and to just present all right comprehensive information against those myths. And so generally our work is out of school, because we are trying to cover all stakeholders who just is against the reality and against the comprehensive sexual education. And what we did, when we have the conversation to the policymakers, the main arguments from them is that, the teachers, the parents against this, and we are just afraid to put it in the curricula. And the main argument always from the policymakers are that we are afraid and they're against it. And what we did is that we, in order to map exact picture, we conducted the different researches with different stakeholders, with teachers, with parents, with young people. And surprisingly, what we discovered is that 95% teachers really want to consider that it's important that comprehensive sexual education be in the part of the formal education settings. And at the same time, 95% of them just said that, yes, we are not ready to provide information and we don't have special skills for this. So we need education and specific skills to communicate with our pupils. And what we discovered when we conducted the research with the parents, it was that 95% of them really want to give information to their kids, but they said that, I don't know how to communicate. I don't know what information is right for her. So to solve these problems, we created two different types of the web pages. One for the parents and one for the teachers. And the teachers' web page was launched in the beginning of this year, and I was surprised because I was involved in the process of the running of the social media campaign of this to promote the webpage for the teachers, and I was shocked and I was surprised, positively surprised, because I discovered that they really need this information, because they are sharing the post, they are saying, oh, this is so good and we really need this, and what will be next? And I was so happy, and it was the hope for me that yes, we can really see the change by step and by the proper working.
I'm sorry, Marta. We have a limited time, so
Okay.
I will be able to ask you another question in the next round.
At the end, yeah, I just want to finish my speech only one phrase, that
Of course,
sexuality
yes.
education is not the privilege, and it's our right, so we should keep fighting for CSE.
Thank you.
for all.
Thank you for addressing the issues and making your own commitments. My last question of this round goes to UNFPA Deputy Regional Director, Mr. Ian McFarlane. Before joining the regional office, he served as the UNFPA representative in Moldova, Albania, and Nepal, and worked with UN and NGOs in various other countries in Africa, Europe, and America. Mr. McFarlane, UNFPA has been promoting comprehensive sexuality education in this region. We have heard some positive examples, but in most countries there is still long away from realizing this goal. What are the risks that you see for individuals, but also for societies as a whole, if we don't make any progress soon?
Thank you very much, Raisa, and also thank you very much to the other panelists who have already talked about some of the risks and the challenges that we face as we look back over the last 25 years and we begin to look forward about what we need to do in the future. I think there are kind of three different types of risk, and I like the way you presented the question, because there are risks related to individuals, and we've heard some of that from the... Am I on? We've heard some of that from the other examples. So there are risks related to the health of young people. We know that in this region we still have unacceptably high levels of unwanted teenage pregnancy. We have HIV continuing and sexually transmitted infections growing. There are risks related to the individual, and of course we have to be very, very focused on understanding and addressing those individual risks. I think another way of thinking about the risks is, if we don't do this, if we don't work on comprehensive sexuality education, then our societies also face risks. And those risks are about missing the opportunity of the largest generation of young people on the planet. And the challenges, and Evert referred to this, the nature and pace of change in our societies is so very quick. We risk missing the opportunity to harness that if we don't have young people who are confident, safe, empowered, and educated. So there's a risk for our societies, and to link the two perhaps, let me give the example of a young woman who becomes pregnant. She doesn't want to be pregnant, or she is forced into an early marriage. She drops out of school. She's unable then to move into a career. It's a spiral of not making the most of the potential that that young girl provides for herself, her family, and her community. So there are risks on the individual level, and there are societal risks if we don't advance more on comprehensive sexuality education. But one of the things that I found quite interesting about the conversation so far is we also have to understand the risks as they are perceived by those who are not yet familiar, or who are not yet engaged, or who are not yet convinced about comprehensive sexuality education. And I think in the way we go forward, we have to take account of, why is it that people resist the words that we use, sexuality? What are the fears that people have? And how do we work, as Hira is doing, on exploring and then breaking the myths that exist? And here I think the approach of Albania, this learning loop, this continuous engagement with parents, teachers, young people, that is a very, very effective way of understanding what the fears against this are, and then developing the solutions that take us further forward. So individual risks, societal risks if we don't do it, but let's also understand the way others perceive this and address the way they see risks, the risks about their tradition, the risks about their family values, the fears of driving the car that we talked about earlier. If we don't address that, then what's going to change in the future will not be as much as we want it to be. So I'll stop there for this round. Thank you.
Thank you for your inspiring speech. And we'll now have the second round of questions, and I will like to address Mr. Janaci. Albania has come a long way, but it's by no means there yet. What are you planning to give all young people in Albania access to quality, comprehensive sexuality education? And would you be able to say by when do you expect this to be a reality? What is the concrete commitment on sexuality education that the Albanian delegation will bring to the Nairobi summit next month?
As I mentioned before, it's on. Okay. As I mentioned before, when you open a program or when you open a reform on education, it doesn't take place in one day. It's a long process, and we're almost not built in one day, as Dr. Evert Ketene mentioned before. So our engagement as the ministry, as the key actors on education, is that we still run investing in three main pillars. First of all, teacher training. Teacher training, teacher training, teacher training is the key. You can write the best curriculum in the world, you can write documents, but if you don't try to convince the teachers to explore their fears, as Jan mentioned, to reduce the prejudices about speaking in an open way, you can do anything. And the reforms on education prolongs with years. The second is working with higher education. It's very important for us that working and advocating the issue with the universities that forms teachers, it's a good options and good opportunity to invest during these years. Sometimes people from different countries do not understand this or cannot match on this idea, but when we discuss with our international colleagues that take care about the curriculum and teacher training, says that the most difficult point is to convince universities, which are autonomous, how to help the pre-university education sector. So it's the right moment to work with them. There has been part and exploring their curriculum and their expertise, but now is the right moment, and we have some options because it's a kind of connections between the higher education law and pre-university education law to be part or to be on board in this kind of mission. The third option that we will invest, and this is a kind of promise that it will go and it will prolong, is working directly with the students. We run in Albania different nice programs and different programs like schoolless community centers, child hubs in the schools, etc., which can be reshaped and redimensioned and linked, because our programs that comes even from other family members of UN, and we can use this kind of program as a space to start even a kind of group discussions with the kids inside the schools, just to explore again the fears and the knowledge that they have. And of course the advocacy is the main umbrella of each pillar that I have discussed, that has inside even the social media, even the public relation and communication fields that should be prolonged again the program for more years. Of course that the debate has been, but this is a technical debate on my side, it should be just a module or just a subject like a comprehensive sexual education, or should be a cross-curricular. In some countries you can find as a subject. In some other countries you can find as a cross-curricular. For example, in Albania we were talking, and I will explain later on our conversation at 4 p.m. It's a little bit late, perhaps you will not be tired, but I will share some reviews and some perception that we have taken from the teachers, how they implement with figures and standards and charts. But on me, on my opinion, spreading the information through biology, civic education, health and sports, for us is functioning. So the same discussion we have with religion and radicalization should be one example, one subject that should be spread. There are two programs, but turning back to our program, it's much more effective if you create 3 pools of teachers who interrupt their ideas and start conversating with each other, share their plans, their ideas, and spread the information in different levels, then the subject. Anyway, this is a kind of debate that can go further and further and further, but for the moment we are convinced that we have chosen the right option for going further with the program.
Thank you, Mr. Janaci, for sharing the future plans that Albania has. Dr. Ketene, you have studied the experience of many countries and have introduced sexuality education in schools. We will talk about this in detail during this workshop, but in a nutshell, what would you say needs to be in place for the breakthrough we so urgently need to be happen?
That is a good question. That's really a good question. Political will is one of them. It's really, really, really important. But, you know, the important thing is, first thing you have to know, young people want sexuality education. Do a survey, ask young people whether they want sexuality education in school. Overwhelmingly, they say, yes, please. That is the truth. Second, it is important to work closely with parents, because they have their fears, they have their thoughts, they think it is their obligation, they think they do something wrong if the school takes over this role, etc., etc. So intensive communication with parents is very, very, very necessary, absolutely. And third is the political will that should be there, and that is what we vote as in our democracies to be our governors. But let me also focus on one other thing, because it is not always well understood. We all the time we talk about comprehensive sexuality education. Do we know what we mean by comprehensive? Do we know what the difference is between sexuality education and comprehensive sexuality education? I think most of us don't even have a clue about what it is. You know, some vague idea, yeah, you tell the truth. And not lies. That makes it comprehensive. Or you tell them a bit more than you would otherwise do, etc. We have done this study in 25 European countries, looking at how comprehensiveness is perceived by the people who are dealing with it. You know, what do they feel is comprehensive? What is comprehensive? And the difference between comprehensive and non-comprehensive is very clear. It's very clear. It is two things that make it very different. The first thing has to do with the contents. If you look at non-comprehensive programs, it is only medical, it's only physical, and it has to do with disease only, and not with other things. So, the typical old-fashioned sexuality education programs is telling young people about, if you're doing this, then you get a disease such it is, and it will give you big problems. That is the old-fashioned sexuality education. The modern comprehensive sexuality education is essentially different. And you can see it from our research. We asked what kind of subjects were being discussed in sexuality education programs. And what you then see is that In countries where it is non-comprehensive, that we call non-comprehensive, it is just this medical, physical thing. And in countries where it is comprehensive, it is an interactive, social, psychological, emotional thing. It's very different. So you talk about emotions, you talk about interaction, you talk about decision making, you talk about all these things that are crucially important, because in the end, what you want to accomplish is have strong young people. Strong young people who can take the responsibilities they should take, who can make the decisions they have to make, who are confident that they can do it, etc., etc. Who are not dependent on the world of adults. They can do it themselves, because in the end, they have to survive. They have to take the decisions. And that is the difference between comprehensiveness and non-comprehensiveness. That is one thing. The second thing, if you do that, if you teach comprehensive sexuality education, you need other methods. Totally different methods. You work interactively. You involve the young people. You listen to, let them talk about what their fears, their ideas, their fantasies, etc. are. So it is a game. You use interactive activities in order to strengthen young people and in order to let them develop the skills they would need in the end. You cannot do that by talking to them. You can't do that. You have to let them work on it. So the content is different and the method is different. You immediately recognize this is comprehensive and that is not comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ketene. Now, Mrs. Kostava, there are a lot of skeptics out there, people who think that sexuality education is harmful for young people. What is your message to them?
Okay, I would be very brief, and I will say only one message or one phrase which I really want to say when I hear some type of the arguments that comprehensive sexual education, we don't need comprehensive sexual education, we know it better. So I really want that we need comprehensive sexual education to improve health of young people, to improve educational attainments, and to achieve the gender equality and mentally health young people. So the change is inevitable, so don't lose the time, and please just make comprehensive sexual education accessible for all and make our rights to be true. Yeah.
Thank you, Magda.
That's my message, main message.
Thank you. Mr. McFarlane, hearing this message as a champion of sexuality education, how do you see the way forward? If not this one, will the next generation of young people finally have the access that we need to sexuality education in our region?
I think Magda just gave you the answer in the sense of, is it this generation or the next generation? It has to be now. And the reason it has to be now is because it's unacceptable that we have the levels of sexual harassment, of gender-based violence, that we have the intolerance and discrimination. If anybody, if any individual is feeling that, then it's too late. So I really do think that we have to understand the urgency of ensuring, as Evert has accurately pointed out, the comprehensive sexuality education that young people are asking for. I really think we have to draw on the models and methods that other countries have had and the experience that exists in this room and elsewhere. I think we have to go to scale like Albania has done. So 500 people were trained. That led to 8,000, I think it was, who were then... You had the cascade that the minister talked about, and there are 32,000 teachers. So that kind of scaling up approach is kind of really, really critical now. And I think we have to learn very quickly. I think that the pace and change that is happening in our world outside of education, but in our societies, is so quick, it's polarizing so harmfully, and the technologies that people are using are so immediate and so extensive that unless we instigate a much stronger sense of how young people can truly be confident about that world, they can be safe in that world and chart their own paths, their own choices, their rights, and they can be empowered to do so. It really is, do it now, scale it up now, and let's learn as we're going along very, very quickly so we make it a reality for many more young people, and that we will all benefit from that.
Thank you for the inspiration, Mr. McFarlane. I want to express my thankfulness and appreciation for having the great opportunity to moderate this very important conversation on what's changed over the last 25 years in the area of sexuality education and the way forward to reach the intended results. I want to share with you all that I will be a part of the Albanian delegation and will represent young people in the Nairobi Summit this November. And personally, as a Y peer, I commit to work with you all and intensify my efforts into reaching young people, focusing more on the most vulnerable and marginalized group with information on sexual and reproductive health and rights. Thank you everyone for being here present. We will now have a 30-minute break, and please make sure to come back in time. Thank you.
Well done.